I was stationed in Louisiana in the Air Force, and though I won't mention the name of the base, many people familiar with the area will know which one it is. The story I'm about to share took place a few years after my initial arrival in 2006. During my time there, I heard many stories about strange occurrences, including tales of a man in a top hat walking a dark dirt road, and a crazy man hit by a patrol car who ran off into the woods. However, my story relates to a different tale that was told to me on my second night on shift. I was posted with an airman who had been stationed there for several years. He told me about a little girl who had fallen to her death from a structure while her father was working on the storage area, which was being constructed before our time. The story didn't make sense to me at the time, but it still sent shivers down my spine. To make matters worse, the airman took me to the exact location where the incident supposedly occurred. We sat in silence, and I was startled a few times, but nothing happened. Fast forward 3 years, I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base. The storage area had been closed down except for a few minor areas that required physical drive-throughs and checks. My shift started out poorly as we were given a cattle truck instead of our normal vehicle due to maintenance issues. We completed 2 checks without any issues and were about to do our last check when we decided to do a final patrol. As we approached the structure from my previous story, I got an uneasy feeling, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The silence became almost complete and frighteningly so. As we approached the structure, I turned my head to the outside of the window and heard a sound that nearly made me urinate myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, similar to the moan from the movie The Grudge. The faint, creepy moan began to echo inside the cab of the truck, and I felt my blood turn cold. I quickly turned to my Alpha and yelled, "Dude, cut that out!" My Alpha looked at me with a confused expression and asked if I was going too fast. I remained silent for a moment, listening intently, and then whispered to him, "Do you hear that?" He stopped the truck in confusion and listened closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two before we both heard it again, the long, chilling groan of a woman. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while being strangled. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more horrifying. I found myself asking my original question again, but my partner quickly interrupted and said, "What the hell is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck and the diesel engine were easily recognizable, but in between the noises, we heard it again. This time, it sounded even louder and like it was coming from both inside and outside the truck, as if we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. My Alpha put the truck in drive and hauled us out of there quickly. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. We got to the 2 gates, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. My Alpha watched my back as I quickly opened both gates, then jumped back into the driver's seat and sped off. We waited for me to close both gates before returning to the main part of the base. We requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened, expecting him to think we were full of it, or that we had just imagined the entire thing. However, he surprisingly said, "I completely believe you. In fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place and the other in that building behind you." I know it sounds cliche with that grudge-like moan, but it honestly happened, and it still brings tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell it. I never went back to that storage area again, and I never went down that road after dark. I haven't shared this story with many people, except for my wife and a few close friends. It happened while I was stationed in the Army as a radio operator during the Vietnam War, and it's an experience that has stayed with me to this day. I was a young recruit, freshly drafted out of high school, with little understanding of the war and what I was getting into. However, I knew I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. Our arrival on a Friday evening, loaded onto buses and taken to our barracks, was marked by the heavy, humid air and the soaked soil, emanating a pungent stench like sewage after a recent storm. The first night was uneventful but tense, with our drill sergeants weaving tales during BAS training, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and uncertainty. As we sat around sharing jokes and stories, I, being more inclined towards technical tasks, listened intently, absorbing the camaraderie and the weight of our mission. My primary responsibility as a radio operator was to manage communications between my unit and others, carrying a cumbersome backpack filled with radio devices and essential supplies. Quickly integrated into a close-knit unit that had recently lost their communications operator to a tragic landmine incident, I found myself thrust into the harsh reality of war sooner than I had anticipated. The first encounter with the enemy was a cacophony of chaos and fear. In the dense jungle where visibility was limited, we exchanged fire with an unseen foe, the deafening sounds of battle echoing through the trees. As the skirmish subsided, we cautiously advanced, only to come face to face with the stark aftermath of conflict. 3 lifeless Viet Cong soldiers, their young faces frozen in death, a stark reminder of the human cost of war. Subsequently, I was reassigned to an intelligence officer named Douglas and his enigmatic unit. During a mission to a heavily fortified area, I stumbled upon a disturbing scene in a secluded hut. 6 severed heads of Viet Cong fighters, suspended in a ghastly display of wires and tubes immersed in a strange green liquid. My curiosity led me to witness this macabre sight, only to be reprimanded by Officer Douglas, who swiftly escorted me back to safety. The events that followed are a blur in my memory, waking up in a triage unit with injuries and no recollection of what transpired after that unsettling encounter. Officer Douglas and his mysterious unit vanished from my sight, leaving me with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of unease. The peculiar nature of that experience continues to haunt me, a surreal chapter in my military service that I can never erase from my mind. The late hours of the night had taken their toll on my nerves. The armored vehicle veered off the gravel road, plowing through the dense underbrush. It had been weeks since Bravo unit had gone silent, vanishing like a wisp of smoke on a windy day. The distress call had crackled through our comms earlier, an unexpected sign of life from our long-missing comrades. But what haunted me more than their sudden reemergence was the content of their message, a cryptic string of numbers. Sergeant Davis asked over the static hiss of the radio, "Are you sure this is the place?" I replied, "That's what command confirmed. Get ready." Our vehicle came to a halt, and we disembarked into the unknown. The silence of the abandoned base grew increasingly unsettling. Buildings stood like hollowed-out husks, with shattered windows and doors hanging off their hinges. The once bustling military hub was now a ghost town. Davis ordered us to stay sharp as we moved forward, our boots crunching on broken glass and debris. Signs of a struggle were everywhere. Overturned furniture, bloodied rags, and scattered ammunition littered the ground. The base was eerily silent, except for our own shallow breaths and the distant echoing cry of the numbers broadcast as we neared the command center. The transmission grew louder, a constant chant that seemed to bore into my mind. Its meaning was as elusive as the shadows in the fog surrounding us. Entering the command center, we found it abandoned, with stale air and the only light coming from the blinking consoles. The radio speakers crackled with static, repeating the sequence over and over in a monotone voice. 582-475-824. Corporal Lee whispered, "What does it mean?" I saw her eyes were wide as she scanned the room. Commander Haskins, the unit's leader, might have known. We continued our search through the desolate base, hoping to find a clue, a survivor, anything. But it was the laboratory that changed everything. The door was hanging off its hinges, as if forced open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and chemicals. Shattered vials and overturned equipment were signs of activity, halted abruptly. Then we saw them, bodies of members of Bravo Unit, or what was left of them, sprawled across the floor. Their faces were contorted in expressions of terror. It was a massacre, but the cause was unclear. No bullet wounds, no signs of struggle on their remains. Lee gestured toward a corner of the room where, amidst the pile of research notes and hastily abandoned experiments, lay the body of Commander Haskins. Clutched in his stiff, lifeless hand was a notepad with the numbers 58247 scrolled across it in shaky handwriting, followed by a single chilling sentence: "They're coming for us." The revelation struck us like a physical blow. The implications of his words spiraled into a million questions with no answers. Who was coming for them? Was this distress not a beacon of hope but a warning? It was then that the reality of our situation descended upon us. The isolation, the eerie silence, broken only by that relentless string of numbers. We were not the rescuers. We were the next victims. Panic set in as the base seemed to close in on us. The fog outside felt like it was thickening. Our only choice was to flee. We ran, stumbling through the fog, guided by the distant light of our vehicle. The numbers continued to echo in my mind, a chant that seemed to follow us, whispering through the fog. Just as the vehicle came into view, a shadow emerged from the mist. A chill, colder than death itself, crawled up my spine as the strange man, cloaked in shadow, moved towards us. "We need to go now." Davis's shout snapped me back to reality. The urgency in his voice mirrored a primal fear within me. Our training had prepared us for many different types of enemies, but we had no idea what we were dealing with here. We scrambled into the vehicle. Lee's hands were shaking as she manned the communications, with obvious fear and shaking in her voice. "This is Alpha Unit calling command. Mayday, mayday. We need immediate extraction from Zone Bravo. You copy?" The radio crackled, interrupting her plea for help, with the numbers repeating endlessly. 58247. I couldn't shake the feeling that those numbers held some kind of meaning into what we had stumbled into. As the base faded into the distance, swallowed by the fog, so too did the person who emerged from the shadows of the fog. Yet the terror it inspired lingered as we raced toward an uncertain future. Davis broke the silence, saying, "We can't let this end here. We need to find out what those numbers mean, and what happened to Bravo Unit." I wanted nothing more than to find these things out as well. I felt like we owed it to them, thinking of the twisted, lifeless bodies we'd left behind. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, I felt a grim determination settle over me. We had survived the night, but the real battle felt like it was just beginning.